thinking about this whole idea of the stimulation and the way our kind of modern world has shifted so much away from the natural world is something that we talked a little bit last week. And we talked about it a little bit. The sense in which we are continually being kind of bombarded in our lives with this artificial stimulation. Sometimes it may help us to think about that the whole way in which the way our consciousness operates is out of a certain sense of values. Think about it this way. What Sylvan Tompkins said was, our values on which we operate are related to our own emotional system, our affect system. He said, without some biological affective response, some sad or glad or fear or shame or interest excitement, nothing without that can be a value. But anything can be valued if it triggers affect, if it triggers some emotional responsiveness. And so, one of the things that I begin to recognize more and more as I study Bois' work and I study Tompkins' work is the idea that we are continually having these values, and our values, even the great values, as Paul Tillich once said, God is ultimate concern. That was his definition for faith. He said faith is ultimate concern. God, he saw, as the ground of our being. Faith is ultimate concern. And so when we talk about issues of religion or faith or belief, we're talking about values over which we have all had our experience shaped through an experience that was emotional. We attached to these images, these experiences of valuing certain things because something felt right or something felt wrong, and we wanted to make it right. The experience of arguments over faith is always interesting when people begin to get into debates over their religious beliefs. I think probably because you can pretty much know from the get-go that, haven't you had this experience that no one is going to change their mind? If you've had this experience. These are aspects of our experience of life that are the kind of most ultimate values, which are not actually fully rational. We are emotionally charged with those things that we are drawn to. The body operates in that way, but the problem is that we get fixed on particular ways of experiencing our big values, those big picture ideas about ourselves and God and life and relationships that are the way we have come to believe that things are supposed to be or are. The problem is, just like the song, life is continually changing. We are continually learning more. In that passage that we read from Genesis, you know, the passage that Denise read for us, there's an image there of the cosmology of the people of the time. The Babylonians, out of which the Jewish people came, had a belief that the earth had been formed by two gods. There was Tiamat and Marduk. And Marduk split Tiamat open like an oyster. And the upper part of Tiamat became the canopy above, and the lower part the canopy below. And so separating the waters from the waters, the dome above and the dome below, is a part of ancient Babylonian understanding that comes from Babylonian mythology. That was in the early writings of the Hebrews, a part of their cosmology. It went unquestioned. It was the way it was supposed to be. It's just the way things are. We know if we're Babylonians, 3,000, 4,000 BC, that we're standing on the body of the God, and above we see the body of the God. But we, as human beings, progress. We learn things differently. And unless we hold on to those very emotionally charged ideas about ourselves and about life and about the way everything is supposed to be, if we don't hold too tightly to those, we can begin to find that we're connecting more directly to the experience of life. And the transformation of that is important. So when I think about this idea of the stimulating environment around us, I have to put my hands in my pocket, because I have a tendency when I talk to keep myself stimulated. And I have found that if I don't feel like I'm getting there fast enough with what I'm trying to say, my hands will try to get there for me. We are people who, if we don't have the right kind of stimulation of the moment, we try to invent it. We're continually transacting with the environment. See, it's hard to keep my hands in my pocket. Because we are creating the world around us in the image that we have had it created for us. So what we are finding is that every human being has a little different experience of all that stimulation. Some people are very easily stimulated. They are sensory sensitive. And others of us are not so much. This becomes a huge deal in relationships, because what is simply exciting or interesting to me, for someone who is very sensory sensitive, is a freak-outville. It's intense. It's over-intense. Does anybody have that experience in here? Yeah. Sometimes, when people come into the 11:11 service and the band starts into something like Under Pressure, just the volume for some people is just a little too much. They're much more sensitive to stimulus. Yeah, I've got my hands going again. So this whole thing about how we all have differences in just the very most simple biological ways plays out in a very interesting way when it comes to the way we've learned to feel. So, for instance, we know that people get interested, this is the face of interest, when neurological firing is kind of going up in a fairly gradual way, usually triggered by novelty. What if that neurological firing for some of us is triggered more intensely because the stimuli is more sensitized? We're more sensitized to the stimuli of the moment. And so we get, instead of just kind of a little interested, we get really interested, and then we get kind of a little over-interested, and then we get kind of excited. I believe novelty, because novelty has this capacity to keep us in that positive feeling of interest, novelty has become the new addiction. And it's provided for us in 1,000 ways every day through all kinds of things. Keeping us stimulated so that we are continually experiencing something novel enough to stay in that place of having the neurological experience of our affect, of the biology behind our emotion, keeping us interested and sometimes excited, can be very much like someone who has been addicted to a drug that makes everything interesting. I've had experiences working with plenty of people who, on some drug, that drug triggered for them a sense in which everything around them, everything they did, had such novelty. Because artificial stimulation made that happen. Artificially stimulating, just read some Timothy O'Leary. Anything can be interesting. Wow. The problem is this, that the more artificial stimulation you get, talk to any of the people that I've worked with who have had addictions, talk to any of them, and they'll tell you the more artificial stimulation you get, making everything feel great, feel exciting, feel interesting, the harder it is to not do that drug. Because you come off that drug, and what happens? Regular life. And regular life cannot compete with the artificial stimulated world. How are you going to compete with perfect simulation, artificial stimulation? How does a flower compete with that? How does a tree compete with that? How does just a regular day-to-day conversation with a friend compete with that? When you're used to this. This overstimulated excitement that's delivered to us constantly through all forms of digital handheld devices, some of which several of us in the room have several in our pockets at the moment. Just because one is never enough. Right? It's me too. I struggle with this. I have to learn. I have to practice unplugging, having some way to unplug, because it's not just the cell phone, the smartphone, the iPad, the computer, the TV. It's becoming the whole culture. Where do we go where we're invited to experience life in a way that's not about continually stimulating our interest? How do teachers manage to teach in schools where students are used to having constant digital entertainment and just having a regular conversation? At that point, if you're overstimulated, if you're addicted, just like if you're addicted to some drug, just coming down and being in life, it feels dull. It feels boring. The experience of life, however, I want to suggest, is something that continues. We all continue to experience those moments where we connect with creation, we connect with each other. It's not like the world has so radically changed that we've totally lost our way, like I tried to suggest in that song I just wrote. But this whole idea seems so important because how we are shaped by the environment is in many ways very biological. The more stimulation, the more the body responds without our having to even think about it. The more stimulation of novelty to our senses, the more easily we find ourselves in this constant state of having interest, excitement, always triggered. So much so that we may find ourselves having it pretty hard to just be still. I wrote a bridge to that song, but I couldn't remember it when we were playing it just now. The final bridge went something like this. It said, the artificial stimulation. It makes it hard to love. It's true. How do you compete with perfect simulation? Certainly not me and you. We can't. The world that we live in with the digital media as we have it and the capacity to create and choose exactly the way we want the stories to come out and to control the world in an imaginary way that doesn't have some of the struggles and some of the pitfalls, that gives it to us like Burger King, have it your way, can become a place where we find ourselves trapped, addicted. The world will more often be about our encounters with those things that are outside of what we know. Our experience of learning to somehow savor things that we often take for granted. People and things that we just walk right past and don't even notice. The spiritual life of our time to counteract this pull has to be, doesn't it have to be, about learning again to savor, to see what is, to listen and see and savor. It's like Matthew Fox said, to be a mystic is the opposite of taking things for granted. We live in a time where we need to experience a re-enchantment of the world and to begin to look into the faces of people and the world around us with a new sense of, isn't that interesting? So there's a guy named William Isaacs who wrote a book called Dialogue, and he says that when you're in a conversation with someone, if you want to make sure that you're not just having the same conversation that you've had 100 times, which we do a lot, that we don't just repeat the same things and expect them to say the same things and you just kind of have the same dialogue. He has this little saying, he says, make it strange. Make it strange. And so my encouragement for you today is a way to kind of maybe change a little bit of how you are transacting with the world around you is to make it strange. Even the things that you think you know, even the people that you think you know, to look at them and think, you're strange. There's stuff I don't know about you. There's stuff I haven't noticed yet. Make it strange. And what you'll discover is the automatic patterns of taking for granted that have numbed us to having to seek out all this novelty. The novelty's right here all the time because it's always changing around us all the time. We don't need distractions of novelty. You can find interest and love and experience right here in the present if you look. Annie Dillard once said, caress the detail. God hides in the detail. Amen.